The following presentation was given at the Unitarian Universalist congregation of Tupelo in Tupelo, Mississippi. All are welcome to join us on Sundays at 11 a.m. at 1301 Marshall Street in Tupelo.
So, Tom Robbins, if I have in my life a guru, it would be Tom Robbins. There's an old Hindu saying that when the pupil is ready, the teacher will come. And while I have had teachers that were embodied, a couple of therapists, a few folks sort of vaguely in ministerial related roles, and sometimes some relatives, ancestors as it were, that have been gurus that I actually knew in person, really the majority of the people who've spoken to me in my life and who I feel have been kind of intellectual, philosophical, spiritual soulmates have been people whose books I read, who I encountered on the printed page. So my first encounter with Tom Robbins came from a person that I was seeing when I was about 28. I had been suffering from what I guess would be diagnosed as sort of free-floating anxiety, which I'd had, looking back, I had a little bit of it all my life. I'm kind of a hyper person. And I had an unusual childhood where I had a lot of uncertainty, even though I was a loved child, and I certainly wasn't abused. But I had parents who I guess you could characterize as treated me with what would call a little benign neglect. They were not, to say the least, helicopter parents. So often I wasn't really sure what was going on and what the schedule was in my life. I didn't have much of a routine as a small child. So when I sought this therapeutic help, that was one of the things I wanted to focus on. But the person that I started seeing had many other talents. He was a multiply interesting therapist, and one of the things that he did was recommend books. So one session I was there, and he said, "Have you heard of a writer named Tom Robbins?" Well, no, I hadn't. And he said, "Well, you remind me of the main character in his first book." And that book was called Another Roadside Attraction. And the character that I reminded him of was a character named Amanda. Now, I think I've mentioned before, I was very much of a sort of 60s person, although I kind of identify more as a Beat Generation person because I was more intellectual and less inclined toward, dancing and, the kind of wild abandon of the hippie era. But nonetheless, I was very much a part of that whole energy, the political and the social upheaval. And Another Roadside Attraction was kind of set in that era. And Amanda was kind of an earth mother figure who wore colorful clothes, as I was prone to do, and who was always in search of adventure. And she has a partner in the book. And it has a lot of it has her story and kind of a love story, but it's also about the idea that somehow the actual preserved body of Jesus has been found in the basement of the Vatican and is now on display as a roadside attraction on one of those little things that you come upon that claims to have jackalopes and four-headed snakes and so forth on American highways. So there's always this kind of weird thing in any Tom Robbins books. There's a story that kind of has a plot, and then there's this underpinning of broad-based philosophical, theological, spiritual, political musings that he does. So that was the first one. And then the next book that I read, that had come out at about that same time, that had given him the reputation over the years of being a 60s kind of novelist, was called Even Cowgirls Get the Blues. Interesting title. And again, hard to ever say what a Tom Robbins book is about. But what most of them have, or what I would call embedded in the story, there are lessons, there are aphorisms, there are little one-liners that are basically advice for living life. So Cowgirls Get the Blues, the main character is a woman named Sissy, who is born with extremely large thumbs. And she determines early in her life that those thumbs make her especially potentially talented as a hitchhiker. So it's, of course, the era where we've been hearing about Jack Kerouac and all the beats going on the road. So Sissy, early in her life, goes on the road, and she indeed does become a champion hitchhiker, has many adventures, and so, again, the plot is not so important as the message. The message seems to be something about leaving, where you're not wanted and seen as a freak, and going out into the big world. So somewhere along Sissy's journey, she ends up with a husband who really isn't appropriate. She spends some time on a sort of all-girls ranch out west, and she meets a doctor, a therapist, named Dr. Robbins, which is, it's the same name as Tom Robbins, so I guess that's kind of his alter ego. Now, Dr. Robbins is full of interesting and unusual advice. So what I took from that particular book are just a couple of tidbits of wisdom that I think still speak to all of us. One is, he says, don't be outraged, be outrageous. In other words, I took that as don't let your anger eat you up, even in this era of stuff politically that's eating most of us up. Just go ahead and be who you are and do the most outrageous things, and perhaps that's what's going to convince somebody else to change more than your letters to the editor and your righteous anger. Another great little aphorism from that book that I have taken way too much advantage of over my career is don't call in sick, call in well. Call in when you feel much too good to go to work and you just want to go out and have a play day. I'm like, what a concept. I don't mind working when I have a cold, but I've got to be somewhere. I might as well be around other people, get them sick too. So I mean, I have called in well many times. Some days I get up and I'm like, I am just not up for going in and doing whatever it is that I signed up to do to make a living. I'm going to go to the movies or go out and sit in a play. So I have found that to be terrific advice. Now, honestly, I didn't have time this week because I preached last weekend in Oxford. I didn't have time to reread the entire Robbins oeuvre, but I'm not sure whether this little tidbit came from Cowgirls or from his next book, which has the unusual title, Still Life with Woodpecker. All of his titles are very odd. But it's the idea that it's never too late to have a chappy childhood. He recommends, as I did in suggesting resurrecting the imaginary friend, that it's never a bad idea to take ourselves on a merry-go-round ride or do something else, or to go out and get an ice cream or a popsicle from the ice cream truck, that we do not have to borrow children in order to go out and do something childlike, that we can take ourselves to some activity that we think mostly children would enjoy, and we could enjoy it all on our own, whether that is a carnival or some kind of a petting zoo, or whether that might be an animated movie. I went to see recently, in preparation for my movie sermon, the new animated movie called Training Your Dragon, The Hidden World, which I understand now is part of a series based on a book. I loved it. It's not for children, it's for anybody. It was a wonderful little magical mystery tour. Now, Still Life with Woodpecker is another one of his books in which there's a prominent position for people with red hair. Tom Robbins himself, before he became old and probably gray-haired, was a redhead. And we all know that one of the things about redheads is that they're sort of scarce. So therefore, he took that as sort of indicating that scarce could mean special. So a lot of that book focuses around two redheads meeting each other and kind of all hell breaking loose. But one of the focuses of that particular book has to do with the idea of how do we make love, romantic love especially, stay. Because we all know that usually there are those first hormone-drenched hours, weeks, months, and sometimes some people let it stretch out for years. But at some point, it's just not there anymore. And what are we left with? What kind of love do we have after those hormone-driven encounters? And that's the subject of that. His next book, which is honestly not my favorite, but I learned many people thought it was their favorite, and that's one called Jitterbug Perfume, which focuses, among other things, on sort of the revival of pagan customs, religious practices, and especially the resurgence of the great god Pan, the great bacchanalian figure of the Greek pantheon, and also has a lot to do with perfume, how things smell. But as I said, I read that book, but it just isn't one that for some time kept in my library, but I know a lot of people love it, so that's definitely one as well. The book of his that I was the most impressed with is, I think it's his fourth book. It's called Skinny Legs and All. And it seemed to me that through all these little aphorisms that stuck so clearly in my mind about being outrageous, not outraged, and never being too late to have a happy childhood and so on, that in Skinny Legs and All, he finally comes clean and lays out kind of a comprehensive, more or less philosophical, theological worldview for us, which I'm going to try to briefly run through with you. This is the closest he's ever come to what a person in seminary would call a systematic theology. And he has basically 7 ideas that he presents. And if you think about it, this covers a lot of territory. Now, what's interesting in that book, the basic premise, is, insofar as plot is a factor in the amazing Tom Robbins world, Skinny Legs and All is set in a deli in New York City run by a Palestinian and a Jewish person together in an effort to create some kind of world harmony. And then the philosophical systematic theology that he sets out is done in the story in the context of a young exotic dancer who recreates Salome's dance of the 7 veils, which is a big thing in the New Testament. If you haven't really kept up with your New Testament study lately, Christian scripture study, I will remind you Salome was the person who danced for King Herod. And at the end of her dance, he asked her what he could give to her that would be her heart's desire. And she said she wanted the head of John the Baptist on a platter. So that's kind of the origin story of Salome and the dance of the 7 veils. What Tim Robbins uses the dance for is to create a metaphor for Salome's dance, teaching us sort of all that we need to know about what it means to be alive and be a person. So when she drops the first veil, the heroine of our story, his name is Cherry, suddenly she gets a little epiphany at the dropping of each veil that is part of the systematic worldview. The first thing she realizes is that the importance of being fully present to our experience and being aware of the fact that sexuality and procreative urge is sort of at the bottom of the human experience. And that so much of religion, traditionally organized institutional religion, especially the monotheistic Abrahamic religions, have been all about repressing that most basic human quality, our ability to be sexual beings and to be urged on in being fecund, as it were. And she realizes suddenly how patriarchy over and over again through history has tried to put restraints on that aspect of being human. When the second veil drops in Salome's dance, she realizes that we have made a terrible mistake in following the dictate of Genesis to have dominion over all other beings. She realizes the fundamental truth of the modern ecological understanding of the world, that plants and animals are also sentient and in many ways share the planet with us as equals. And she begins to realize that that idea of subjugating nature as opposed to being in harmony with it is one of our most self-destructive tendencies, and we have to move beyond that. When the third veil is dropped, her insight is that political solutions alone will never solve the fundamental problems of humanity. That we have to have an overall understanding of the philosophical underpinnings of things before any ideology, any form of government will really take us into, the promised land, back to Eden, whatever metaphor you want to use. When the fourth veil drops, Cherry's insight at that moment, her epiphany, is that religion in any of its forms is always an effort to pin down the divine and somehow make it smaller and manageable and something that someone can somehow explain to us in a comprehensive and final way. As the fifth veil drops, she continues along the same line and realizing that the foundation of religious institutions is always about, in a way, the sense of dominance often associated with patriarchy, although it doesn't necessarily have to be entirely a male thing. I mean, women can be into dominance and overriding power also. But basically, she realizes that institutional religion is almost never a liberating factor. When the sixth veil drops, and she's getting close to being, in the altogether, as we say, she realizes that there's only so much that we can learn from other people. She realizes that even the wisest of gurus and teachers has limits. And this continues as the seventh veil drops, and she realizes the hardest thing ever, and something we're grappling with in our present time a lot with both religion and politics: nobody else can do it for you. Religion is a participation sport. You cannot say that Jesus saved you. You cannot say that reciting a certain mantra is the ultimate solution. It is an ongoing and messy process to build a worldview that enables you to live in a sort of happy and liberated fashion. It doesn't happen all at once. Now, because we have all this revelation happening in the context of something going on at a cafe run by two groups that are often seen as enemies, there's quite a bit of preoccupation in his book with what's going on in the Middle East. And this book was published in 1990. So you can see that things haven't really gotten better. And another aphorism of Tom Robbins that he reiterates frequently, he'll often say, as he's sort of grounding his book in the present moment, he'll say, the world situation is desperate as usual, letting us know that whatever is going on now will pass, but probably something else that seems equally catastrophic and unnerving will surface again, and that it's our job as we develop our worldview, liberated through this dropping of the seven veils, to figure out how to take that on. But he does give special attention, in a very interesting metaphor, and skinny legs and all, to the Middle East. And this is what he says. "Consider the anatomy of the Middle East," said the inner voice. "Hasn't it been called the Fertile Crescent, the primordial uterus from which the human race was said to emerge? Well, look at it today. Consider it now. Of all the places on the planet, it is the most feverish, hot, pain-racked, tense, dilated, bloody, traumatized, stretched to the point of ripping place. Remind you of something? The trouble in the Middle East is nothing but natal contractions. The world is in labor, and the Middle East quite obviously is the birth canal out of which, if it doesn't abort, the new order of humanity must be born. The labor is difficult and long, and it may get much worse before it gets better. But but don't despair over the Middle East. Something great, something wondrous, something completely unimaginable now is there a-borning." "Are you putting me on?" thought Ellen Cherry Charles, but then a carload of loudmouths drove by, chanting the score of the Super Bowl game, and she heard nothing further, nor could she generate another pertinent thought. So all this is going on, and this is the chaos and the wonder of his amazing books. So I've shared with you some of the aphorisms. I've shared with you a little bit of his, what I would call the closest thing he ever came to developing a systematic theology. Some other lessons from later Tom Robbins books, and something that I've thought about for my whole life. And Emerson, great Unitarian thinker, talked about living with contradictions. He talked about the idea that sometimes We're at our best when we are the most contradictory, and that we are humans. As humans, we are capable of holding ideas at the same time that seem to directly contradict each other. And Emerson's favorite poet, Walt Whitman, put it this way. He said, I am large. Do I contradict myself? Very well, I contradict myself. I am large. I contain multitudes. And one of Robbins' later characters is a CIA agent. Seems like an unlikely person from such a reprobate thinker as Tom Robbins. But he creates a character who he said is a contradiction for all seasons. His name is Switters in the book. He describes him as an anarchist who works for the government, a pacifist who carries a gun, a vegetarian who sops up ham gravy, a cyber whiz who hates computers, a robust bon vivant who can be as squeamish as any fop, a man who, though obsessed with the preservation of innocence, wants to seduce both young and older ladies. Yet there is nothing remotely wishy-washy about Switters. He doesn't merely pack a pistol, he is a pistol. And so that book, which has the really weird title called Fierce Invalids Back from Hot Climates, that book's primary message is about embracing the contradictions within ourselves. One cannot be merely sensual or merely spiritual. One must merge the two to be a fully realized, fully developed human being. Every one of Robbins' books has its own little strange plot, its own digressions. He's willing to give voice to things like spoons and tin cans, so we get to meditate on the world from unusual angles. But the one thing I think he always is about liberation, about liberating ourselves from constraints, liberating ourselves from the mental shackles that we're brought up with in the confines of whatever our family of origin is, whatever our religion of origin is, whatever our culture of origin is. So today, I think what I want to leave you with is the idea that whether you get it from reading Tom Robbins or some other author of choice or from reading different spiritual lessons, anything that constrains you, anything that gives you strict rules, anything that is overly judgmental about who you are and what you do, be highly, highly suspicious of. Thank you.
Thanks for listening to the UUC of Tupelo's podcast. You can find us at uuctupeloms.org, on Facebook by searching for UUC Tupelo, or contact us by email at uuctupelocom@gmail.com. That's uuctupelocom@gmail.com. The UUC of Tupelo is a welcoming congregation who accept all people, regardless of creed, color, national origin, gender, or gender identity. We hope you have enjoyed this podcast, and as you head on your way, go in peace, believe in peace, create peace.